Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wild's the Dome TV. Today, I have a very special guest. You've seen him on here before. Very amazing scholar, author, professor, martial artist, cultural memory keeper. He's just a brilliant brother, and I'm always glad to be able to speak with him. Dr. Kamau Rashid, thank you for coming through.
For sure, brother. Thank you for having me. Always glad to be here.
Indeed, indeed. So today I wanted to kind of talk about Malcolm. We're on his 100th. This would be his 100th birthday. And so, I guess I'll begin with, the early roots. And can you speak on the influence of Malcolm X's parents, especially with his father's Garveyism and his mother's Garveyism? Because there's a book. Got it somewhere around, but it's the three mothers, and it talks about Malcolm's mother, Martin's mother, and James Baldwin's mother. And
Wow.
in the book, it talks about Louise Little going to Garvey meetings with her uncle in Canada before she met
Mm.
his father. But I was just saying that to say this because, a lot of times we just attribute the Garveyism to just his father. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
But anyway, when it comes to that, um, can you talk about Garveyism and how that could have possibly and I'm pretty sure both of us feel like it did shape
Mhm.
Malcolm's consciousness
Mm.
before his political rise.
Yeah. I really appreciate that question, and I think it's important to contextualize Malcolm X and his family within the malaise of
Hmm.
African people, right? The challenge that we face in terms of our oppression. Because that's one of the things that you get, especially I think in Les Payne's biography, he does a very good job of situating Malcolm's family in a historic context, right?
Hmm.
And specifically in terms of his father, racism in Jamaica. I'm sorry, racism in Georgia. I'm sorry, but also we talk about his mother and colonialism in the Caribbean. And so I think first we have to deal with the fact that Malcolm is emerging out of the same historical continuum as the masses of African people in this hemisphere,
Hmm.
right? Only a couple of generations at best removed from slavery in this country, as well as colonialism and slavery in the hemisphere. And so I think that has to be understood. And also Marcus Garvey, you know, the emergence of Marcus Garvey and the emergence of the Universal Negro Improvement Association also similarly has to be looked at within the continuum of Africans' efforts to bring about self-determination, right? If
Hmm.
you think about what was happening in this country after the Civil War, whether we're talking about the formation of independent black towns, the immigrationist movement which
Hmm.
emerged, I think both of these movements were signifiers of black self-determination, right? A
Hmm.
striving by the black masses for sovereignty and self-determination. And so Marcus Garvey's emergence on the scene and his, creation and establishment of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the United States, or introduction of the UNIA to the United States, was in many ways a refinement of the conceptual focus of these pre-existing movements, right? Well,
Hmm.
it's still concerned about sovereignty and self-determination, but we're beginning to look beyond, to consider this beyond the borders of the United States, and to consider this in the context of the types of historic struggles that African people are waging around the world, to say nothing of the types of movements that African people are waging in the Caribbean, for self-determination, against colonialism, against the vestiges of enslavement, and for political autonomy and the like. And so in many ways, the emergence of the UNIA represents the dynamic focal point of many of these interrelated struggles
Hmm.
for African self-determination in the world. Um, and I would also argue, in many respects, represented the maturation of those struggles,
Hmm.
right? Because Marcus Garvey is positing that ultimately the solution to our problems is, rather than see our struggles as isolated, disparate struggles that are contained within the territorial borders of some European neo-colony,
Yeah.
that we have to consider our struggles in the context of the African world as a whole. And
Hmm.
so this movement was a great maturation of our thinking in terms of how we think about Black struggles in tandem, right?
Hmm.
And so Malcolm's family, like many of our families, often are drawn up in the wake of the struggles around us. This is why ideas are so important. I remember when I was younger, elders would talk about how our movement for liberation has peaks and lulls.
Mm.
And I think they were arguing at the time, this is like, the early to mid 90s, maybe, that we were in a lull of Black consciousness. And you look at the state of people today, like in
Hmm.
the United States,
That
that
might have
seems
been a high point in the 90s
I
compared
know,
to.
right? I'm like, you sure that was a lull? I don't know. Oh no, that was a lull. This is the lull.
Right.
These Negroes, they think they're from Mars. I mean, I don't know what's going on with the minds of some of these people, just drunk with ignorance. But I think that the with regards to the with regards to the UNIA, I think Marcus Garvey was able to advance a compelling vision, and to that end, because his idea was
Mhm.
because of the coherence of his idea, because of the expansiveness of this idea, right,
Mhm.
and also because of his organizational capacity,
Mhm.
uh, and the way in which he was able to integrate novel elements, not just the political education, but also the economic development, also utilizing culture, whether it's music or literature, music and so forth, as instruments that have the capacity to raise the political consciousness of the people. The UNIA represented a dynamic synergy. And so it's
Mhm.
not unsurprising that the parents of Malcolm, given their own lived experiences, and when I say their own lived experiences, I don't mean just them personally, but their forebears' lived experience and the social environments that they came out of were drawn to this. And I think this shapes their imagination, that shapes their way of seeing the world in a number of important ways. So I think, and so I think that it was that environment, and I think in Les Payne's biography, he talks about the way in which Malcolm's childhood, and at least in those first 6 years, were patterned in many ways in relation to his parents' involvement with the UNIA,
Yeah.
whether it was participation in meetings,
Mhm.
the various types of slogans he would have encountered, the various ideas that he would have encountered. Ultimately, this idealization of Black freedom,
Mhm.
right, is
Mhm.
something that he would have encountered, and that his estrangement from those ideas, given the type of disintegration that occurs in his family after the death of his father, that I would argue, and I think and many people would argue that seed had been planted.
Yeah. Yeah.
That and I think, and what I mean by that, what the UNIA signified, what Marcus Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey and this movement signified, is the possibility of African freedom,
Mhm.
right? The realization of African freedom in the world.
Mhm.
Uh, and this is a profoundly dynamic vision, right? The profundity of it was clearly not lost on the people that tormented Malcolm's family. His
Yeah.
father had difficulty finding work. They were often shunned by Negroes around them who felt that these ideas, these Pan-Africanist nationalist ideas, were threatening. But this is a really dynamic and audacious vision which was being proposed, and I
Mhm.
would argue that Malcolm was inculcated in that,
Mhm. Mhm.
at least those first 6 years of his life. And despite everything that happened subsequent to that, that is over the next decade or so, that this had a profound impact in terms of his consciousness, not just in terms of how it anchored him, but also how it anchored other members of his family, right? Who
Mhm.
becomes another anchor for him that becomes very meaningful when he gets a little bit older.
Yeah. And also, what I was just thinking about, just like whenever you were brilliantly explaining that, is even some of the similarities with the UNI and the Nation of Islam at that time,
Mm-hmm.
from the African Legion, the FOI, Black
Mm-hmm.
Cross Nurses, MGT.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been obviously, the religious aspect of the Nation of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
We can't divorce its politics from that, but this idea of nationalism,
Yeah.
the symbolism that's often used,
Yeah.
and that is so very similar, in my opinion. I remember I saw a video a while back that said that they remember seeing Elijah Muhammad in a few UNIA meetings in Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you can see a lot of things that he probably inspired
Mm-hmm.
what he did with the Nation of Islam, and that just kind of made me think of that as well. Like even the organizations of itself, one being more Pan-African than the other, obviously. And
Mhm.
we'll get to, and later on we can kind of get into it, but
Yeah.
that was one of Malcolm's criticisms of Elijah Muhammad whenever he left, was
Mhm.
that he didn't feel like Elijah Muhammad talked about Africa enough.
Yeah.
And that would have been something that obviously, would have instilled in him from the
Mhm.
time he was a baby.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
In your view, like how did Marcus Garvey's legacy live on through Malcolm,
Mhm.
ideologically and strategically?
That's a wonderful question. Um, there's an essay in I've been talking about this a lot of late. There's a Amos Wilson's book, New World African Consciousness versus the New World Order, Garveyism in the Age of Globalism.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter in there called, I think it's called The Total Nationalist. And in this chapter, what Amos Wilson does is he talks about the work of Marcus Garvey and the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as being demonstrative of, he basically called them total nationalists. That is, that they set about the business of creating organizational structures that attempted to comprehensively address the needs of African people. So I want to start with Garvey because Garvey is the framework and the foundation. And I think to your point, I think he provided a model that other organizations like the Nation of Islam emulated. It has to be understood that Marcus Garvey he didn't set out to build simply an organization,
Right.
right? Set out to create, a nation,
Yeah.
you and not a nation like in the context of, how Jamaica is a nation or Haiti is a nation or even the United States is a nation, but a nation that comprises, certainly the African continent, the
Mm-hmm.
totality of the African continent, but also the African world.
Mm-hmm.
So he's conceiving of a level of organization. I mean, you have to think about this, like, in terms of how the proximity of enslavement,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that uh, I think most of the Caribbean, though not all of it, is still in the much of the Caribbean, I should say, at this time is still in the throes of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the entirety of the African continent, with the exception of a few places, are in the throes of colonialism. And he's conceiving of this Pan-African nation.
Right.
You know? And so it was the breadth, the sheer audacity of Marcus Garvey's vision, which left an indelible impression on the minds of many people who come later on.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the breadth of that vision, they can't take it all, but
Yeah.
they take the parts of it that fit within their framework, right?
Yeah.
And certainly
Absolutely.
the Nation of Islam, I would argue, in Kwame Nkrumah took
Mm-hmm.
aspects of Marcus Garvey's thinking, and many other people. Well, the point is that I think there were a number of, aspects of Marcus Garvey's thinking. I think whereas if we take Malcolm before the split with the Nation of Islam, I think theologically, right, much
Mm-hmm.
of his theological orientation certainly is informed by the nation. And I would say certain elements of his political thought, but I would argue that much of his political thought, especially as it related to the role of Africa, the critique of colonialism, the importance of Pan-Africanism, the interrelated struggles of African people in the world, I would argue that much of that thinking was heavily informed by the UNIA, right?
Absolutely.
All ideas have a source, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, I'm not, like, I'm not saying that a person can be a genius and conceive of something which have not been conceived before, but in many instances, human ideas have an antecedent in human experience, even if it's the human experiences of one's forebears. And so I would argue that much of that thinking as relates to Pan-Africanism was emergent or derived from the template of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. So what are the particulars? One is the idea that we are an African world. So when Malcolm talks about, in some of his speeches, he talks about the connections between Mississippi and Congo, that you
Yeah. Love it.
understand Mississippi until you understand Congo, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He understood that these struggles were inextricably linked. He understood colonialism as a system, imperialism as a system, and it's not a system that ended at the Atlantic, at the western border where the African continent meets the Atlantic Ocean. He
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
understood that it was a world system. And so when Marcus Garvey talks about, the hegemony of European nations, he understood Western dominance as a world system that shaped the lives of African people in the United States, shaped the lives of African people in the Caribbean, shaped the lives of African people on the continent. So that was one of the places where their ideas were synergistically linked. They understood this oppressive system that we're up against as a world system. He also understood, of course, the necessity of unity, an expansive form of unity. Again, that we can't simply be concerned simply with uniting Black folks in your city, on your block, in
Right.
your region of the country, but we have to think about African people as a whole and how we can effectively marshal that collective force in relation to struggle. And so this idea of the massification of struggle.
Mm.
And Marcus Garvey was a genius at appealing to the masses of African people and
Hmm.
attempting to reshape how the African masses thought about themselves. And he recognized that it was a need not simply to appeal to people's minds, but to appeal to their hearts.
Yes,
Right.
indeed.
And part of the genius of Malcolm in his oratory and the genius in his oratory and his genius as an organizer is reflective of him also having that capacity. Uh,
Hmm.
so again, this idea of African unity and the massification of struggle as a key element. I would say the third thing is this idea of the need to build comprehensive organizational structures. And of course, for Malcolm, the direct experience with this comes from the Nation of Islam, right?
Hmm.
That was one of the things that they took, from the UNIA's organizational structure, that you have to create a comprehensive organizational model that looks at economic development, that to a certain extent looks at issues of policy, though one of his ongoing critiques of the nation was this, he felt his political engagement was insufficient. Addresses issues of safety, addresses, again, the needs of the people as comprehensively as possible.
Absolutely. Hmm.
And if you look at his plans for the Organization of Afro-American Unity, when he lays out that platform, when he lays out the agenda, you see this orientation towards this comprehensive model of social development, where we're dealing with culture, we're dealing with organization, we're dealing with health, we're dealing with education, we're dealing with economics, we're dealing with politics, we're dealing with all the different dimensions of Black life. And
Right.
so in many ways, I think he was attempting to create something, but that in many respects was more expansive than the
Mm.
nation program, that was much more aligned, in fact, with the Garveyite model, that I think informed his thinking in a number of important ways.
Absolutely. And for everybody watching, I don't want you guys to think that we are saying that Malcolm got nothing from Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because that's not what we're saying at all. I think that's a given. We pointed out the connection with Garvey because I think it's something that is often overlooked, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Mhm. And so, I guess that leads me to this question. How should we understand the transition from Malcolm's time in the Nation of Islam to the founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity? And what was its purpose, and who were some of the key figures involved?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting thing, because for Malcolm, as I said, the the Nation of Islam, I think, more than anything else, provides the framework, nationalist roots,
Mm-hmm.
right? The
Hmm.
Nation of Islam, to me, was the vehicle by which he returned to his
Right.
nationalist roots. The Nation of Islam became the developmental medium whereby he became this person whom we continue to study, and whose insights we draw upon today. And so, whether it's this orientation or this emphasis on Black nationalism as a key imperative, and specifically in relation to territoriality,
Hmm.
right? That was articulated in the Nation of Islam. Not first, of course, in the Nation of Islam, because this is also something that you get this in the UNIA. You also get this as far back as the 19th century, people like Martin Delany. So this idea of territorial sovereignty has
Hmm.
a long history in Black politics. I think the Nation of Islam also gives him an important perspective in terms of the role of theology, the role of religion, in terms of how this connects to the transformation of a people. And then finally, organizationally, right, the structural dynamics of the Nation of Islam gives him a framework to draw upon. And again, I think once he moves away from the Nation of Islam, he attempts to revisit each of these foundations, right? So if we take, so I said, nationalism as a type of Black nationalism as a type of political project, uh, the, um, the organizational structure, and I said a third thing I forgot, but it'll all come back. So I think theology. The second was
Hmm.
theology. So when he moves away from the Nation of Islam, and you see this especially if you look at his remarks, especially like in 62 stands out to me in particular, 63 up until the point where he's silenced and so forth. Um, you see him increasingly focused on the colonial struggle in Africa,
Yes.
increasingly focused on the colonial struggle in Africa, increasingly engaged in a political analysis of that system of colonialism,
Hmm.
the system of imperialism, which enabled Western states to dominate Africans around the world. Increasingly looking at the way in which this system is interrelated with and parallels the subordination of Africans in this country. And so after he leaves the Nation of Islam, of course, this aspect of his work and this aspect of his thinking expands in a number of ways.
Mm.
And I think some of the people that influence this, certainly are people like Patrice Lumumba, who, of course, by this time has been assassinated. Uh, but it's impossible to decouple ideation, that is thought,
Hmm.
from its human antecedents.
Hmm.
And so Malcolm's conversations, his interaction with certainly people like Nkrumah,
Yeah.
uh, certainly people like John Henrik Clark,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
Uh, People who are engaged in independent struggles. You think about when he goes to Africa in '64.
Hmm.
Uh, Many is in the context of many of these interactions that his thinking about nationalism and about Pan-African nationalism is being refined,
Yes.
right? It's being
Right.
refined. And so it's no longer simply this focus on the way that a type of territorial sovereignty was articulated within the context of the Nation of Islam, but it becomes this Pan-African nationalism that considers territorial sovereignty in a very expansive sense, not just in relation to the Africans in this country, but also
Hmm.
in terms of how we think about the African world and how we think about uh, secure this sovereignty, the acquisition of sovereignty, and the maintenance of that sovereignty for the African continent and the African diaspora as well. So I think that his interaction with a lot of these thinkers contributed greatly to his own thinking because he was able to look at these struggles and to see these struggles as things that we could learn from, right? I
Hmm.
mean, one thing that has to be understood, Malcolm is studying, he's learning from the world. He's studying the world. And this is also while he's in the Nation of Islam, right? So
Right.
as much as he's being shaped by the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he's also being informed by what's happening in these various anti-colonial struggles that are happening
Hmm.
in parts of the world. He's looking at what's happening in the civil rights struggle,
Yes.
right? And he's drawing conclusions about what is efficacious, what is inefficacious, and the like. The second thing, I guess, in terms of I should do well, I guess the second thing in terms of the theological orientation, I think that his thinking about religion shifts, right? Because obviously he transitions from the teachings of the Nation of Islam to Orthodox Islam, to Sunni Islam. And I would argue that one of the threads that remains consistent in his thinking is he posits that Islam is a means of facilitating the re-ethnicization of Black people in the United States.
Hmm.
Right? When we
Hmm.
talk about the re-ethnicization of a people, we're talking about the way in which a spiritual or religious practice transforms the character of a people.
Right.
And I would argue that was an indelible element in terms of the teachings of the Nation of Islam, one which Malcolm championed,
Right.
right? That these teachings have the capacity to transform people's minds, not just around many of the behaviors that are celebrated in the Black community today. I'm thinking about well,
Yeah, all right, we got you.
yeah, yeah. But also in terms of how it gives us an understanding of who we are,
Yeah,
in terms
right.
of how it reorients us to our humanity
Mm.
as
Hmm.
African people in the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
Once he leaves the Nation of Islam, of course, he begins to draw increasingly upon Sunni Islam. In many instances, like those two messages continue. Again,
Mm.
Islam as a means of facilitating the re-ethnicization of African people in the United States. Uh, Hence, Muslim Mosque Incorporated in one of his missions, but also, and of course, also Islam and how it has the capacity to transform our relationship to ourselves.
Mm.
But also, there's a third element that gets added on in terms of the relationship of Islam to the larger African world and the larger world of people who are struggling against anti-colonialism.
Yes.
And so, one of the things that emerges then is Malcolm begins to see Islam globally as an anti-colonial force. Now, certainly in
Right.
the United States, he's conceiving it as a force which is opposed to the subordination of Black people in the United States, but he begins to increasingly conceive of how Islam can operate or be operationalized in this anti-colonial struggle that Black people are waging and other people are waging around the world. And so he begins to see Islam as inextricably linked to that in ways. And then again, there's some similarities, but I would argue the way he's thinking about this, from a theological standpoint, certainly expands because now he's thinking about this community of Islam, this community of Muslims around the world. And I would say the third thing, I think it was around his oh the breadth of his political vision. Uh, so again, two elements, right? So first, again, with regards to the UNIA, and so I want to digress a bit, with regards to the UNIA, whereas many people drew upon aspects of the UNIA and its structure and the legacy of Marcus Garvey, no one really replicated the breadth of the UNIA's vision
Hmm.
because of the breadth of that vision.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Similarly, uh, once Malcolm is on his own and once he establishes the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he also is oriented towards something which is comparable in terms of his breadth. And he's drawing upon a range of models, both organizational as well as methodological approaches to liberatory struggle. Everything from, the idea of us controlling the economics of our community. Remember, we talked about our economic philosophy as Black nationalism, our
Hmm.
political philosophy is Black nationalism, right?
Hmm.
But also in terms of how we think about the safety and security of Black people, right?
Right.
Because Malcolm is not a pacifist. And
Hmm.
beyond that, he's looking at armed struggles around the world as a key model of revolutionary struggle and
Right.
as something which may be imperative, some type of revolutionary struggle, whether it's violent or not, in terms of resolving the contradictions inherent in the condition of the Black people in America. And so he begins to think expansively about what the process of liberation looks like, what the
Hmm.
process of liberation looks like. What I think he moves away from in the final analysis is away from this idea, the the idea in which sort of the end state or the transformative outcomes of the Black community as they had been articulated in the teachings of the Nation of Islam, to a process where he's thinking about, which I would argue was one that was very much bound up in theology. It's
Hmm.
very much bound up in the type of theological prescription and sort of this theological resolution of the
Yeah.
Malays people in many respects, to one which is very humanistic in its orientation. That
Hmm.
is, how do we free ourselves?
Right.
Right? And so he begins to consider a range of methodological tools that informs their process. Tools that, of course, I don't think he would have articulated, like when he lays out the platform of the UNIA in 60, I'm sorry, the OAAU in 64, like one of the things that is very clear about that the need for a cultural revolution.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And what does that entail, right?
Hmm.
Because the cultural revolution isn't just putting on a dashiki or
Hmm.
having an African name, right?
Hmm.
Or Muslim name for that matter.
Hmm.
The cultural revolution entailed a much more thoroughgoing process of the transformation of one's consciousness, but also a concurrent transformation of the world.
Yeah.
And so the breadth of the vision, I think, expands greatly, largely because he's drawing from a number of dynamic models, but he's also thinking about these things, right? And he's looking at the limitations of pre-existing approaches, such as what he saw in the Nation of Islam, and what the condition, what the problem that we were faced with necessitated.
Indeed, indeed. And it kind of reminds me of whenever I believe it was at the speech, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, when he talked about we need a Mau Mau in the South,
Right,
right?
right.
Right.
Yep,
And
exactly.
that always stuck out with me as part of, just again, pulling from these different traditions that he had been studying, he had been exposed to, and actually traveling, right? Seeing
Hmm.
what's
Hmm.
going on. It's kind of like how we spoke about off camera. Uh, it's it's what's in you,
Yeah,
sometimes that
yeah,
feeling that you get from the experience,
yeah.
uh, putting, testing out theory, putting certain theory into practice, just
Hmm.
being a part of this radical tradition and
Hmm.
actually doing something, right? It's something in here
Hmm.
that can be extremely transformative with the way you view our plight and what needs to be done.
Yeah.
When we talk about the OOAU, I have a book. I haven't read it yet, but it was A. Peter Bailey's book about the Pan-Africanism of the OOAU.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
But if you can, when we are talking about the OOAU, and you went through a lot of it just now, but how did it reflect Malcolm's evolving like internationalist and Pan-African
mhm,
vision? Because I definitely think that's important because like you mentioned earlier, like I don't know what some of these people are on, but there's nativist groups that are
mhm, mhm,
totally trying to divorce Malcolm from um, any type of Pan-African international vision
mhm,
that he
mhm,
had, and
mhm.
which is just it's made up, right?
It's
It's
lunacy.
not, yeah,
Yeah, it's lunacy.
yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but yeah, if you can, just speak about that some.
Yeah, yeah, and I really appreciate that you referenced the madness that becomes currency for many unthinking minds, because uh, Malcolm was a student of history,
Mm,
and he, yeah, I don't think in his study, I haven't encountered in my study, encountered a context where atomization leads to an enhancement of our capacity to engage in revolutionary struggle, right? Atomization being the subdividing of a people, right?
hmm
So we can break Black people down into this
hmm
category, break them down
Yeah,
into smaller categories, and break them into that's atomization.
right.
I'm not aware of any instances historically where atomization actually serves our interests.
It
Uh,
does.
but atomization is actually very effective for one's
hmm
enemies,
hmm
right?
hmm
When he has this rally for the OAU in the spring of '64, there are three important things that are articulated in that, which I think reflect this vision. One, he talks about the importance of Africans in this country being unified, engaging in a unified struggle against oppression. Again, he was advocating for a massification of struggle, right?
Right.
Struggle waged by not waged and guided by some Negro elite. You remember back in '63 in particular, he's very critical of that Black leadership strata and the
Right.
corruption and corruptibility of that leadership strata. And he's very much concerned about that.
hmm
So he's advocating on one hand for Black unity and the necessary massification of the struggle, right?
hmm
Uh, the second thing is that this term Afro-American, Malcolm Afro-American did not consist or was not limited. The term did not simply apply to people that were born within the contiguous United States plus the states of Hawaii and Alaska.
Right.
Afro-American were all Africans in the Americas. And
hmm
it's important to note, right? So he's
hmm
thinking not just of Black people in this country, but he's thinking about our collective interests. And of course, the third is the African world.
Right.
And he very explicitly, this document very explicitly talks about the necessity of engaging in the struggle in the interests of African people globally, uh, but starting first by unifying African people in the Americas. And so he saw the struggles of Black people in the world as inextricably linked. And I think that was one of the most powerful elements of the OAU's platform. This articulation of an expansive orientation towards Black unity, uh, whereby again we're talking about again struggle in the interest of Africans in this country, unifying African people in the Americas, engaged in for the sake of liberatory struggle, and of course the African world. And so it's an important way of it's an important and necessary way of thinking about our struggles,
Yes.
because in the absence of that, because again the politics of atomization has become fashionable and we have to deal with that, right? Again,
hmm
human ideation has always has antecedents, and we find, of course, in any era, people are attracted to ideas not because of the viability, the logic of those ideas, but because of the popularity of those ideas. Uh, but there's no systemic mechanism whereby African people could transform our condition in the world on the basis of atomization. And Malcolm was very clear about that. He was
Yeah.
very clear about that. And one of the you might argue that he looked at each of these struggles that were happening in the Black world as laboratories,
Mm-hmm.
and he's studying them. So
Mm-hmm.
when he looks at what's happening, when he looks at the situation in Congo and he sees how uh, Lumumba's efforts to transform Congo were supplanted, undone by the West,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and not only by the West but also by Negro collaborators. Right,
Yes.
this is very instructive to him.
Right.
When he looks at the these anti-colonial struggles in many places, when he looks at the struggle in the South, When we talked about the March on Washington and this divide between the sentiments of the masses and the sentiments of the elite, he sees again, this is very instructive to him, and the importance of noting how this leadership could be corrupted. And so he's really taking, I think, borrowing from the playbook of the UNIA very explicitly in this sense. That when we talk about struggle, when we talk about the marshaling of forces in struggle, we're talking about the African masses, right? And ultimately, we're talking about the African masses acting on a shared vision for African future, African
Yes,
sovereignty and African self-determination in the future.
indeed, indeed. I think I'm glad you said that because that is definitely something that we have to deal with in our community. This idea that um, just a nativist view of Black liberation is somehow what we need, especially in such a trying time. It just makes me feel like this is government sponsored, but
It has to be.
yeah.
And just to say something about that real quick, and the problem is that, I mean, historically, it's not a very compelling idea.
Right.
Let's say we entertain this idea as having some basis in legitimacy. Well, the problem is that, after a certain point, the inter-American trade, becomes the primary mechanism by which new Africans were brought to the United States from
Hmm.
other parts of the Americas. And so none of us came directly, not none of us, I'm sorry. At a certain point, a disproportionate number of us would have been people who were brought from other parts of the Americas to the United States,
Absolutely.
right? From Haiti and from Martinique,
Hmm.
Jamaica, and even Brazil. And so the point is that none of us are these pure,
Right.
Americans who had no historic connection and no
Hmm.
genealogical connection with other Africans in the diaspora. It's just a silly idea.
Yeah,
Silly
and
idea.
not to mention African Americans went to Haiti, went to
Right.
Brazil, went to
Exactly.
other
And Trinidad.
and
Right.
Trinidad.
Exactly. It's a silly idea, which to me has to be a contrivance of our enemies.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree 100%. When we talk about Malcolm and his complex relationship with the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, both the mentorship and the eventual political and ideological rupture, just what are your thoughts on that whole paradigm?
Yeah, I think it was tragic in many respects. I think that when I think about Malcolm and the circumstances that eventually forced him to leave the Nation of Islam, I'm reminded of uh, there was this Eyes on the Prize documentary, A Nation of Law. This is the episode where that focuses on the half of it focuses on the assassination of Fred Hampton.
Hmm.
Of course, the FBI and the Chicago police were looking for evidence that Fred Hampton was doing something wrong.
Right.
They couldn't find anything because Fred Hampton was a dedicated revolutionary.
Yeah. They
And
put
I
the
think
ice cream truck thing on it.
exactly at the manufacturer
Yeah.
something, yeah, the ice cream. Was it $70 for the ice cream or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah.
Malcolm, I think, was very similar in that way. He was fully committed
Mm,
uh, to the work, not even to his own self-interest.
mhm.
And so I think that for him, the rupture uh, it was inevitable in the sense that for him, uh, issues of character, you know, issues of character had to be addressed. Issues of
Mm,
character had to be confronted. Um, I think like many of the revolutionaries of his time, he was not necessarily inclined to consider contradiction in this sense as being appropriate or desirable.
right.
This makes me think about something Walimu Baruti talks about. He was doing a talk and he talks about how, Black people, how we in our in folly often talk about contradiction as if people being possessed of contradictions is a positive thing.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, he talked that Black stuff, but he's out sleeping with all these other kind of people, for example, right? But contradictions are are fundamentally are issues of fundamental importance
Right.
because the disjuncture between our words and our deeds reflects a disjuncture or reflects insufficiencies in our commitment to the aims of the
Mm,
struggle we're supposed to be engaged in. I think that's how Malcolm saw it.
yes.
I think that's how he saw it in a number of respects. And so for him, what he perceived of as a contradiction in character was something which necessitated a response. Though I don't necessarily think, that he anticipated the way this would all unfold, right?
Hmm.
But suffice it to say, I think in many respects, uh, one of the things that came out of that rupture was that it created a context for Malcolm to fully explore uh, his own thinking, especially as related to Pan-Africanism,
Yes.
especially as related to the importance of revolutionary struggle, uh, as well as other things, and this, and some of these are areas which were not fully developed in his thinking at the time of his assassination, such as his critique of capitalism.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? There's a burgeoning critique of capitalism because he begins to talk about the interconnections between the system of capitalism and imperialism, and that line of thought was growing right at
Yes.
the time that he was assassinated. So I think in many ways the rupture became fruitful in the sense that Malcolm was no longer constrained by a particular set of theological prescriptions, but he was at that point able to think about these things expansively. I would argue that when he created those two organizations, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, as well as the Organization of Afro-American Unity, it was also done, I would say, in part because of his that insight that it is
Hmm.
important for us to conceive of the political project that we engage in as being aligned with but distinct from the particular spiritual or religious project that we may be engaged in. Obviously, these things are
Yeah.
inextricably linked, but I think he was keen to avoid the recreation of a situation where a particular set of theological orientations might preclude one engaging forthrightly in liberatory struggle. And I see this all the time. I'll see and hear and read stuff where people are taking the position that because, and it's usually some universalist religion,
Hmm.
Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, religions that purport to be for all of humanity, where people will say, "Oh, because I'm engaged in this universalistic religion, that it is somehow inappropriate that I be focused on the interest of Black people, or the
Hmm.
ways of Black people, the challenges that we confront, or and forthrightly identifying the people who are the purveyors, the instruments of that suffering." And of course, I would consider this folly. And
Yeah.
Malcolm would have considered it folly. But the point is that I think this is also part of why he thought that the religious project and the political project should be distinct,
Yeah.
related, but
Hmm.
distinct.
Yeah, because he didn't he specifically say, hey, when it comes to, I mean, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but when we're talking about revolution, leave your religion at home. I don't think he
Yeah,
meant in a sense where, not be faithful to whatever your spiritual practices are, but
yeah.
we can't let that get in the way of what we have to do. And would you think like the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, like, would that be like part of the cultural nationalist, like, you know, as we are trying to decolonize our minds
Yeah.
and as you know how the church, especially during that time, would have been looked at by many who were revolutionaries or
Hmm.
coming
Hmm.
into a certain level of consciousness. Would
Yeah.
that kind of be like a part of like the cultural nationalist like thing that he needs to get out somehow, right?
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, I think Malcolm did see it like that. And this is something I've been thinking and reading a lot about of late. Because I don't think that we can reasonably say that Malcolm does not consider the embrace of Islam by Africans in the United States as a type of, as really an expression of an act of not only self-determination, but also a type of re-Africanization.
Hmm. Hmm.
Malcolm didn't necessarily see a hard separation between the embrace of Islam and and this idea of returning to or restoring a type of
Hmm.
consciousness or
Yeah.
orientation of our ancestors. Um,
The same way people today may see that with going back to Isheshe or voodoo or
exactly.
something. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And part of the reason for that, and you see this certainly in his, even when he's in the Nation of Islam, he's talking about
Hmm.
Islam in West Africa, right?
Yes. Hmm.
And he and which is interesting because he's talking about how he was arguing made these arguments about Islam as being a catalyst in terms of or being a contributing factor to the greatness of these various West African Sahelian empires. Think
Hmm.
about Mali
Mali and
in
yeah. Hmm.
particular.
Hmm.
And so Malcolm sees within Islam certainly a means whereby we reclaim, aspects of that the values of certainly the values of our ancestors, and something which was a contributor, he would argue, was an element, an aspect of the sort of social and cultural context which informed the greatness of our ancestors. And so he certainly sees Islam as that. And so he does see Islam as a means of facilitating a type of re-Africanization, a type of restoration of consciousness. But
Hmm.
he also sees it uh, because and I really appreciate, like you said, cultural nationalists.
Hmm.
Because what's clear to me is that there are many people in the African community who are champions of culture, but not necessarily champions of nationalism.
Right.
Right? And of course, it begs the question of, if your culture doesn't affirm your right to be self-determining in the world, is your culture, to what extent has your culture not been corrupted by your enemies? Because
Right.
that
Whose culture is it at that point,
whose
right?
culture is it? And at that point, exactly.
Hmm.
And when we see that, certainly with Black popular music in America,
Hmm.
right, it's somebody's culture,
Yeah, yeah,
Black
yeah.
people's culture. That's a culture,
Yeah. They should like to say this is a representation of our culture though.
right?
Like, yeah,
Really, really.
yeah, yeah.
Promote with the last thing I'll say though is that, yeah, I think for him, Muslim Mosque Incorporated reflects both of those things, that it
Mhm,
represents certainly a cultural mission.
mhm.
I would argue the religious and spiritual pieces entwined in that.
Yes.
And maybe I'll say one last thing about that,
Mhm.
after I say this,
Yeah, sure.
is that, but it's also inextricably linked to the project of Black nationalism,
Right.
right? Pan-African nationalism.
Right.
But one thing that to me is evidence of this,
Mhm,
he talks about the need for language classes.
mhm.
He said that, I think they had launched an Arabic class, and that they were talking about classes in Swahili and Hausa,
Wow.
you know.
Wow. You know what that reminds me of? Whenever I had an interview with Sheikh Sufi, and he was
Yeah.
down there in Tuba, in Senegal with the
Yep.
Mourids,
Yep.
and he said whenever he was with the elders and he was living amongst them, and he was wide-eyed and wanted to learn everything.
Hmm.
They said before you learn Arabic, you need to learn Wolof. And,
Mm.
and I was just like, wow.
Hmm. That's right.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, that just goes to show, like that book that I had. And you sent it to me a couple years back, I think, the book about Sufism and Ifa
Ah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
traditions in West Africa, and
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so yeah, I think in a lot of ways Malcolm was right about that. Even before some of the scholarship
Hmm.
has come to surface, I
Hmm.
think he was onto something.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a lot of ways he was. Again, he his thinking about Islam was very multidimensional.
Hmm.
And that's why I try, I think that there are reductive tendencies among Black folks. They'll say, well, Islam is this religion from Western Asia.
Hmm.
How could it be anything other than a source of alienation among African people? But we have to remember the cultural genius of African people, right?
Right.
Whenever people embrace a tradition, in most instances, that tradition is assimilated.
Hmm.
They assimilate that tradition within their culture.
Right.
This is why
You
Black
got
churches, white churches aren't the same.
No, you might
And
see some mojo bags in a black church
seriously.
in the
And,
South,
and that's
man.
what Katrina Donald has it rights about. The people in the
Absolutely.
church practicing
Right.
hoodoo, you know. And Malcolm, I think he was clear that in West Africa, and I'm certainly he saw this in his travels in West Africa, that Black people in West Africa had approached Islam in a way which reflected their particular history and
Hmm.
historical and cultural orientations.
Hmm.
The Nation of Islam, think, in many respects, was also instructive in this way, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Islam in a way that reflects the interests and concerns of Black folks. And I don't think he had relinquished that in his conversion to Sunni Islam. I think that, and again, if you look at many of the things, the way in which he articulates the importance, or the way he articulates the work of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, I think he saw the need for that same orientation to continue. This idea where Islam is a type of, is in part facilitative of this process of,
Yeah,
of cultural transformation.
absolutely. And I interviewed recently Sheikh Bilal, who's of like a West African Sufi tradition, and he talked about Sheikh Ibrahim and how first off he didn't pray like 5 times a day. He didn't pray at all.
Interesting.
He would say La ilaha illallah like as his zikr, but he
Mm,
wouldn't pray.
mm,
And he was always looked at as someone who would not abandon his cultural traditions
that's right. Hmm.
before he
Hmm.
was introduced to Islam. And like you said, many in what we're looking at Mali or Senegal
Hmm.
and a lot of these empires, it wasn't necessary. I think a lot of people get the wrong idea, but it wasn't necessarily um, uh, us assimilating into Islam, but assimilating Islam into our traditions, right? Because of that, many of the early, Arab explorers, colonizers that saw, these black Muslims in these kingdoms would talk about, hey man, they're not real Muslims. They still sacrificing
Right.
animals and
They
stuff.
still got
Or yeah,
ancestral
yeah,
finds in
yeah,
the corner.
yeah. They still got shrines, like, but
Right.
I mean, and I think that's one of the also. I think that is also reflected in how in the early 1900s the formation of the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of
Mhm.
Islam.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
to this day, the larger Ummah will say they're not real
Mhm.
Muslims, but who's to say that? Because that's what we do. We do
Yeah.
things our way.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
Um, One of the things that is really important to me as far as a focal point of study at the moment is in the years following Malcolm's assassination, uh, and we know his assassination also is one of the things that popped off the Black Power movement and
That's
the
right.
actual rebellions that
Right.
were taking place. But when we look at people like the Black Panthers and Huey and Bobby Seale, we look at Amiri Baraka, and all of these different revolutionaries that were coming after Malcolm.
Hmm.
A lot of them, like when I interviewed Dr. Penderhughes, who was in the New Haven chapter during that time, and he's flat out told me, say, "Hey man, everybody felt like they were the heir to Malcolm.
That's
That's
right.
how important
That's right.
he was." But with that said, how did these figures that I just mentioned, in your eyes, carry on and carry forward Malcolm's revolutionary legacy?
Yeah. And so it's kind of like what I said about the UNIA before. The breadth of the UNIA's work was as such where it would have been difficult for any formation, any single formation to capture that in its totality.
Hmm.
Similarly, the breadth of Malcolm's vision was also one that it would have been difficult for any single formation, any a single thinker to capture and reflect the
Yeah.
breadth of that, both
Right.
in terms of their ideas,
Right.
the organizational platform, but also in terms of the structure of their organization itself. And so what you see happens and happens all the way down to the present moment.
Mhm.
People seize upon facets of Malcolm thinking, but generally not Malcolm's thinking in its totality,
Right,
right? And so in
right.
that period, from 65 to 72 or 73, we see that expression, right? So you could look at how Malcolm talked about the need for revolution. He was an advocate of armed struggle. And you see that being something which formations like the Black Panther Party,
Hmm.
seize he emphasized territoriality, the
Yeah,
necessity of territorial sovereignty. You
right.
see formations like the Republic of New Africa seize upon that. He literally calls for a cultural revolution. He
Absolutely.
emphasized the importance of us reclaiming our African minds, right? And you have organizations,
Like
the
us.
nationalist formations like
Hmm.
us, as
Hmm.
and later the Congress of African People,
Hmm.
seize upon that. When
Hmm.
you read the UNA and the OAAU platform, he talks about the need for us to develop educational models which are dynamic and responsive to our needs as people, which are facilitative of our liberatory struggle. You see the Council of Independent Black Institutions seize upon that. The point is that what you get in that period from 65 to 70, 72 or 73 are a host of formations that are coming into being that are seizing on aspects of Malcolm's ideas and
Yeah.
attempting to operationalize those. I would even argue well, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But the point is that you have a host you have many different groups that are seizing upon facets of his ideas, and I think that tells us a couple of things. Um, what I think a number of thinkers, and well, no, I'm sorry. Before I say that, I have to say this. The other tendency that we notice is others seizing upon Malcolm's critique of capitalism and his critique of imperialism,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
so the point is that you'll have people today, they'll say Malcolm was a revolutionary nationalist, Malcolm was a cultural nationalist, Malcolm
Hmm.
Malcolm was an economic nationalist,
Hmm.
Malcolm internationalist. Malcolm was a socialist, right?
Hmm.
I was in Colombia a few weeks ago at a Malcolm X event,
Mm.
and there was a guy that said Malcolm was a socialist.
I got a
And I,
I got like a communist newsletter
yeah,
somewhere that says
yeah, yeah.
Malcolm was a communist.
Well, I think it begs the question of what did Malcolm say he was?
Right.
I think we have to deal with that, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wouldn't want to get up out of here and then somebody 80 years in the future say, Kamau Rashid was an anarchist. Like,
Right, right, right. When did I say that? Right.
not say that, But I think that what I think is at play,
Hmm.
and I'm giving folks the benefit of the doubt in many instances, but I think is at play is that people are attempting to, it's either two things that are happening. Either people are seizing upon the aspect of Malcolm's thought which most resonates to their orientation towards liberatory struggle. And I think
Hmm.
that's part of what's happening. But
Hmm.
I think that in a lot of instances, though, people are attempting to identify the kernel.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
What is the core?
Hmm.
Right? What is
Hmm.
the core out of which these other aspects emerge or evolve from? And therein they focus on a particular facet of his thinking.
Right.
But I think Malcolm's thinking was very comprehensive.
Mm.
Again, I think that he considered all these things as both necessary and constituent elements of Black struggle,
Hmm.
regardless of what happens after his assassination. He considered all these things in their totality as being necessary elements in our liberatory struggle.
Absolutely. And that just goes to show his brilliance that
Exactly. Yeah.
you have all of these different uh, revolutionary movements who can form an ideology just of a piece of Malcolm's
That's
ideology.
fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah.
That's fascinating.
Um, what and speaking of that though, there's one thing that and this is all right. So there's been a rise of mainstream scholarship on Malcolm.
Hmm.
Um, and I read that Ibram Kendi has a new book on Malcolm.
Hmm.
And I haven't read it, so I don't have a critique or anything on it. But I do know that we have experienced, obviously, what has happened with Dr. King, as far
Hmm.
as being divorced from his politics and
Hmm.
sanitized and then repackaged to us as "I Have a Dream" speech,
Hmm.
right? None
Hmm.
of his critiques on capitalism or his,
Hmm. Hmm.
the international understanding that he had,
Hmm.
visiting Nkrumah and things like that. We don't get
Right.
any of that, right?
Nope.
We get the speech. But when it comes to Malcolm, uh, what do you make of? Because I'm starting to see this happen with him as well. But what do you make of how establishment narratives engage with or sanitize Malcolm's radical politics?
Yeah, yeah. This is a serious one, and
Hmm.
there's there are reductionist tendencies and how people think about Malcolm and his
Hmm.
ideas.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, the problem is that, and I began to see this back in the '90s when I was a young man. This is right after when I was a young adult. Uh, the Malcolm X, Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie had come out.
Yes. Hmm.
And what you saw in that decade, in the years following the release of that film and its relative success, you saw people attempting to claim the legacy of Malcolm in a number of ways.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
you have whether it's Malcolm and people seizing upon his Muslim faith
Hmm.
uh, as a way of emphasizing the importance of Islam and Black people embracing Islam. Because certainly, I mean, this is also part of Malcolm's thinking as well.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also these reductionist tendencies which emerge,
Mm.
and I've seen them. There are two particular groups of thinkers where I've seen these most. But I'll say that among those who are most hostile to Black nationalism,
Yes.
where has
Hmm.
been and this has been most prominent, right?
Hmm.
In
Interesting.
fact, I would say those who are opposed to Black nationalism,
Hmm.
those who are opposed, and those who are advocates, who are reformist advocates
Hmm.
of the United States, right? Because you have
Right.
a lot of people, they're reformist, so
Mm.
they love America, they just want America to be better. Malcolm,
That's not that's
relationships.
not
Yeah, that
Malcolm.
ain't him. That ain't him. And
Yeah.
so for the first group, that is those people who are opposed to nationalism, and some of those reformist people are opposed to nationalism, but there are many socialists who are opposed to nationalism.
Hmm. Hmm.
As
Oh,
into
a lot.
nothing of
A
integration. This is
lot.
that.
I've
exactly.
seen, and not to cut you off, but
No, go
it's
ahead.
been a little bit irritating. I've seen a lot of um, non-black leftists have been comparing the Republic of New Africa to Zionism.
Yeah,
It's
I've
like,
been
whoa,
that. Yeah,
whoa,
it's
man, what are we
insanity.
doing?
It's insanity.
What?
Um, and we could spend a whole show talking about that.
Yeah, yeah.
But for those, Malcolm never deviated from nationalism.
Hmm.
You know, again, one of the things that I credit the Honorable Elijah Muhammad with shaping Malcolm's thinking in a number of ways. Uh, Certainly in terms of inculcating his thinking about the importance of territorial sovereignty.
Hmm.
And also giving him a theological foundation, a spiritual foundation to operate from. And so the point is that the the there has been a desire to diminish or to distance Malcolm from his own nationalist foundation, his own nationalist roots.
Right.
Um, and again, when you look at his speeches, when
Hmm.
you get his interviews, and when you look at even the OAU's platform, again, this is 64. This is, he unveils this about 10 months before his assassination. It's very clear that he remains committed to nationalism.
Hmm.
And he's increasingly thinking about or conceiving and articulating nationalism in terms of what we would call Pan-African nationalism, right?
Right.
He's not thinking of it in relatively narrow terms, but thinking about this very expansively. So he never retreated from nationalism. Nationalism continued to be a part of his thinking. And again, many people are hostile to nationalism. And so if you're hostile to nationalism, then it becomes expedient to
Hmm.
emphasize his critique of capitalism, his critique of colonialism.
Hmm.
But again, we have to be very clear. Malcolm was critical of capitalism,
Hmm.
right? And he posited that the system of capitalism be supplanted by a system that operated in the interests of African people, an economic system that African people controlled. This
Right.
is nationalism,
Right.
right? Malcolm was critical of imperialism, and he
Hmm.
advocated that people should have the right to be self-determining, to exist within territories that were under their own aegis. This is nationalism. Malcolm
Hmm.
never retreated from nationalism because he
Hmm.
argued that self-determination was a fundamental right of African people. Secondly, there is a tendency, and I've been saying this since at least the 90s, but it's probably older than that. People want to make Malcolm into an integrationist.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And
Hmm.
again,
Oh
he never
yeah.
retreats from his critique of America. He never retreats
Hmm.
from his critique of America and the degree to which America was itself a state that was oriented toward or organized around the maintenance of empire around the world. He never backs away from that kind of thinking.
That I'm not. I'm sorry. That
No, no,
just
please.
it's. That really bothers me a lot. Like that whole notion, because I still see it to this day,
Yeah,
and it's this idea that he left Elijah Muhammad and he sees the light, and he's it's they turn him into a peace loving hippie, right? Like,
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
I often think too, like, the fact that whenever he changed his name, he kept Shabazz in his
Hmm.
name,
Yeah.
which kind of can shows you like still the ideological connection that he had with Elijah
Mhm.
Muhammad,
That's right.
even
That's right.
leaving.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I just had to posit that because
Yeah, yeah,
I literally saw that probably a couple of days ago, and it's like we're
yeah.
still saying this.
Yeah, it's bizarre to me, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he never deviated from that foundation. And so again, and just to put a finer point on it, or to kind of revisit something that I said earlier, like I see, well, we all see the arc of Malcolm, like the
Hmm.
arc of his thinking.
Hmm.
To me, it's one that reflects congruence more than incongruence. And
Hmm.
this is what people want us to posit. They want us to entertain this idea that there's incongruence in Malcolm's thinking.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
that the formative elements of his
Hmm.
childhood, in terms of his initial connection to Pan-African nationalism, meant nothing.
Right.
That he
Right.
embraces the Nation of Islam, but he becomes disaffected with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and he leaves the Nation of Islam, and that political and idea of spiritual foundation meant nothing, and then he becomes this humanist socialist. And this is reality. And again, when I make the point that there's congruence in terms of his thinking, my
Hmm.
point is this, that Malcolm emerged within a familial context, familial and organizational context, predicated upon Pan-African nationalism.
Hmm.
Right? That there's a lacuna, there's a separation of that context but that seed is nurtured and watered within the context of the Nation of Islam, particularly the nationalists, not so much the Pan-Africanism, but
Hmm.
certainly nationalist elements of it, right? And the Nation of Islam gives him a way of thinking and operationalizing this thinking, this project of Black nationalism, this critique of the oppression of Black people, of operationalizing, these ideas in the world. At which point he leaves the Nation of Islam, he begins to expand, and that expansion, I would argue, in many respects, reflected much of that Garveyite foundation, much of
Hmm.
the thinking and organizational structure of the UNIA, in terms of thinking about nationalism, not simply in the domestic sense, but in a global Pan-African sense. And so, to me, there's congruence in Malcolm's thinking
Hmm.
that's evidenced throughout the arc of his life, rather
Hmm.
than incongruence. And I think those who make this argument that there's this incongruence in Malcolm's thinking, I think they have an ideological axe to grind, you might say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do you think even those who may not have something to gain from it, but just have a misunderstanding, um, not even just the movie, and don't get me wrong, the autobiography of Malcolm X is what got me on my journey, right?
Yeah, same here.
But I have been told by elders, it's like, yeah, we love that, but that's not what we were reading. We were reading Malcolm X Speaks. We were
Hmm.
reading books where Malcolm was talking about his revolutionary ideologies.
That's
This
right.
is
Yeah,
what I had gotten from Panthers. So I would just implore people to not just limit
right.
yourself to reading the autobiography of
That's
Malcolm
right.
X, because you'll be missing so much of who
That's right.
Malcolm is by just sticking with that.
Yeah, you want to read the primary sources. Yeah, you want to go
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
yeah, read his speeches, read his interviews.
And
The
that
autobiography
64
is fine.
diary, and
Yeah,
that 64 diary when he went to Africa, that's
that's right.
important. Hmm.
Yeah, because
Hmm.
those and it is important, and there's been a lot of discourse about this of late. Alex Haley. People have talked about Alex Haley's orientation
Hmm.
to Malcolm's life and ideas, and so really the best source in terms of understanding Malcolm's thought is to read Malcolm's thought.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, I wanted to kind of end it here. First off, again, I always appreciate these conversations, man. But on a personal level,
Yeah.
what has Malcolm meant to you in your own intellectual and political journey as we reflect on the 100th anniversary of his birth? What do you
Mhm.
think we should carry forward most from his life and work?
Really appreciate that question. Much like yourself, it was the autobiography of Malcolm X that was how I started down this
Hmm.
path. Um, with the problem that I was facing, and this is I was 16 when I read it, and so the problem that I was facing is that I was living in a world where the situation, the condition of our people, and the why, sort of the reason for that condition, no one around me had explained, why are
Right.
we in this situation and what are we attempting to do about it? Why have these pre-existing efforts been insufficient or unsuccessful, right? How have our efforts to transform ourselves and liberate ourselves been undermined over time? And so that book was really my first attempt to find the answers to that question.
Mm.
And the autobiography of Malcolm X and Malcolm's life gave me a conceptual vocabulary.
Hmm. Hmm.
That book introduced me to Black nationalism,
Right.
introduced me to Pan-Africanism,
Hmm.
introduced me to anti-imperialism.
Hmm.
And and all I've done since then is build on that foundation.
Right.
All I've
Right.
done since then is build on that foundation. So Malcolm was, for me, in many respects, that when we talk about my own coming into Black consciousness, Malcolm
Hmm.
was the first teacher.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. And he is for so many people because
Mhm.
whenever I have somebody that I haven't interviewed before come on the show and I kind of ask them what got them started on this path, Malcolm is like the overwhelmingly
Yeah.
majority of the answer. And um, autobiography of Malcolm is usually,
Yep.
the point of entry
Yep.
to, the Black radical tradition
That's right.
for most of us.
Yeah.
Dr. Kamau Rashid. Mhm.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say this, which is
Mhm.
why it's so important to render Malcolm as a Negro. This is
Mm.
why it's so important for people to sanitize him, for people to bleach him, to pour coffee cream and a cup of
Well, let me ask you. Let me ask you this real quick. Uh, now, right, as someone who's been doing this work for a really long time, what are your thoughts on the movie?
The Spike Lee movie?
Hmm.
That's a good question. I probably need to go back and watch it because I haven't watched that movie in a long,
Me
long,
too.
long time.
Hmm.
So the I didn't like that it simplified Malcolm's journey.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
so you get was it Baines? I think Baines was the
Yeah.
main
Instead of
character
his
rather than
brothers.
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. It's, and so because that familial piece I think was important. Uh, it we don't get a clear sense also in that film of Malcolm post the Nation of Islam,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
uh, because there's a world of meaning that in a world of ideas that occurs in that period and connections that are made. So I thought that it insufficiently captured that period. Um, those are the things that readily come to mind. I think that suffice it to say, it doesn't, what the movie is not is a presentation of the political thought of Malcolm X.
Right.
That's what it's not,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Because we don't get a sense from that movie of the breadth of Malcolm's thinking.
Yes.
And so to me, I think the movie is good for what it's good for. That is that it's something that got many people thinking about Malcolm.
Yes.
Yeah, many that may have gotten many people to read his autobiography, many people to think about the importance of his ideas and his legacy. But the danger of I don't want to say danger, but the challenge that the movie represents is that many people don't read,
Mm.
and many people, they take cinema as historic artifact,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
that film is not a recounting of Malcolm's history, not in any meaningful sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, I always appreciate these conversations. Much honor and salute to Brother Malcolm on his 100th anniversary. And you're definitely the person that I wanted to build with about this and his legacy. So we appreciate your work and everything that you do. And again, thank you for coming through.
For sure, brother. Appreciate what you're doing as well. It's so much ignorance out here in the world, and I think you're helping to bring light and enlightenment to our people. So asante sana to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right. Well, to the next time, my brother. Peace.
Peace.